that history cannot be forgotten. Now, this being the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and this being in February, Black History Month, it would not come as a surprise to you that we are going to be focusing today, and indeed in several of our forthcoming fundraising presentations during the course of this month, we're going to be focusing on various aspects of that history, because it is so important for us to address that history, to remember that history, and for us to re-examine our understanding of that history and those things that we all of are all 516-620-3602. So I should be able to keep you apprised of how well we're doing. But I'd like you to make that call right now, 516-620-3602. And it's a call, a pledge of support to listener-sponsored commercial-free WBAI New York. We are broadcasting at 99.5 FM. We are a listener-sponsored commercial-free radio station, which means we do not accept any corporate or advertising underwriting. We rely exclusively on your support. It is what makes it possible for us to keep this diadem in the middle of the FM dial. We rely on your support. Your sustaining contributions to WBAI are what make it possible for us to remain on the air, to keep the lights on, to keep these microphones live, to keep our transmitter functioning from the Empire State Building, and to meet all of the necessary and unavoidable costs of operating a radio station in the middle of the number one media market in the world. When we tell people how much it costs, how to maintain WBAI, people in the profession are astounded by this, because it is impossible. What it takes to run this radio station for an entire year, about $3 million, is less than the budget of most of the feature magazine type programs on any of the big networks. So it's really a remarkable accomplishment, a remarkable feat that you have been able to sustain this enterprise for more than half a century in the number one media market in the world, and we are very grateful to you for that support, and we ask you to continue to enable us, to empower us to tell the stories that the corporate media will not tell, because, of course, those are the stories that would conflict with their interests. We, however, are able to tell those stories because we are beholden only to you. We're not beholden to any of the corporate or commercial advertisers. So the number again is 516-620-3602. We're going to be turning over several hours of prime time in the middle of the number one media market in the world to a re-examination of one of the most monumental aspects of American history, and that is American complicity in the role of the slave trade and the institution of slavery. Slavery we often refer to as America's original sin. But that slavery, the institution of slavery, was sustained and fueled by an exercise in human trafficking that went on for hundreds of years. And this is often the hidden underbelly of the institution of slavery. Slavery, as terrible, as horrendous, as horrific, as catastrophic an event, a historical event as it was, it was made possible by the slave trade, and it is the slave trade to which we will be dedicating so many hours this afternoon in prime time here on WBAI. And the only reason that we're able to do that is because you are paying the bills for this radio station. You are keeping the microphones live. You are keeping the lights on because of your support. Remember, you can make a tax-deductible contribution because we're a not-for-profit. Your contribution to WBAI is tax-deductible, and you can make that tax-deductible contribution at any level that is comfortable and convenient for you. At the $100 level this afternoon, we'll be very happy to say thank you by sending you your very own copy of the documentary film Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north. Traces of the Trade, a $100 tax-deductible contribution to WBAI. Now, in this documentary film, Traces of the Trade, the producer and director Katrina Brown tells the story of her forefathers, who were the largest slave trading family in American history. Now, given the myth that the South is solely responsible for slavery, many people would be surprised to learn that Brown's ancestors were Northerners. The documentary follows Brown and 9 fellow family members on a remarkable journey which brings them face to face with the history and legacy of New England's hidden enterprise. Now, here on WBAI, we're heard in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, throughout the tri-state area. That's our primary signal area. You're also listening to us. Many many of you online at WBAI.org, where we can be heard everywhere in the world. But wherever you are listening, the number is the same to make your pledge of support, 516-620-3602. That's 516-620-3602. Now, by way of background, from 1769 to 1820, members of the De Wolf family, fathers, sons, and grandsons, trafficked in human beings. From 1769 to 1820. Now, bear those dates in mind, because remember that the slave trade was supposed to end officially in 1808. Okay? So we're looking at a period from 1769 to 1820, when, which means that for a significant period of time, for a number of years, this is a family which is based in our family in Rhode Island. This is a family that was engaged not only in the slave trade but in the illegal trafficking. This is as if the trafficking in human beings was not in itself a sufficient. A sufficiently horrendous crime against humanity, even after it was officially, in quotes here, ended, the slave trade. They continued with the slave trade. The De Wolf, DEWOLF, that's the name of the family. The fathers, the sons, the grandsons, trafficked in human beings. They sailed their ships from Bristol, Rhode Island, to West Africa with rum to trade for African men, women, and children. Captives were taken, and you know, this thing about the children, this is also something that is often overlooked in our historical narrative. It is often the case whenever we see depictions or portrayals of people being sold on the auction block, of Africans being sold into slavery. It is often the case that we see grown men and women, adult men and women. What is often glossed over in that narrative is the number of children who were also abducted from continental Africa and forced into the holds of these slave ships, and those who could made it across the Middle Passage and were sold at auction here. You know, I was reminded of this in a conversation with my father some years ago, who said to me that his grandfather was brought to Guyana as a boy of about 10 years old or thereabouts, from the Gold Coast. And it did not make any sense to me at the time. This was many years ago. It didn't make any sense to me at the time, because I'm trying to do the math and I couldn't figure out how could this possibly be that he was brought there as a boy of 10, because no matter how long any person lived, this would have had to be well after 1834, which would have, or 1838, which was when slavery was officially abolished in the British Empire, of which Guyana in the British colonies, of which Guyana was a part. So it did not make sense to me, but it was only after some further reading and consideration and consultation that I realized that this slave trade extended for decades beyond the official abolition of slavery, and also in the British colonies, and beyond the abolition of slavery in many other parts of the world. So the children we often forget. Well, the De Wolf family, over the course of their engagement in the slave trade, brought as many as, over the generations, the family transported more than 10,000 enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage. Remember, I mentioned this is a family that was based in Bristol, Rhode Island. Okay, captives taken to plantations that the De Wolfs owned in Cuba. This is how they operated this. They would take the captives from Africa. They would often take them to plantations that the same family, the De Wolf family, owned in Cuba, or they were sold, the captives were sold at auction in other ports such as Havana and Charleston, South Carolina. Sugar and molasses were then brought from Cuba to the family-owned rum distilleries in Bristol. And as I mentioned, over the years, the family transported more than 10,000 enslaved enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage, in the process of which they amassed an enormous fortune. By the end of his life, James D. Wolfe had been a U.S. senator and was reportedly the second richest man in the United States. Now, the enslavement of Africans was business for more than just the De Wolfe family. And here again, this is an important lesson to be learned from this documentary, Traces of the Trade. This enslavement of Africans and the slave trade that provided the bodies for that institution of slavery, this was a cornerstone of northern commercial life. The triangle trade drove the economy of many port cities in the Northeast. Rhode Island had the largest share in the trade of any state, but slavery itself existed in the North, here in the North, for over 200 years. Northern textile mills used slave-picked cotton from the South to fuel the Industrial Revolution, while banks and insurance companies played a key role throughout the period. And while the De Wolfes were one of only a few so-called slaving dynasties, the network of commercial activities that they were tied to involved an enormous portion of the northern population. For example, many ordinary citizens would buy shares in slave ships in order to make a profit. So today we hear people say, well, only rich people had owned slaves. This may be true. It was not universally true. You could own a slave or two if you were not that rich, but people now say, well, only rich people own slaves, and my family was never in that of that economic class. Well, what we learn in this documentary, and as historians have begun to look more closely at how this business, the commercial aspects of the slave trade and the institution of slavery worked, what we find out is that many ordinary citizens would buy shares in slave ships in order to make a profit. You see, so ordinary, regular, middle-class people also benefited from the slave trade. Now, the documentary follows 10 members of the De Wolfe family, 10 descendants between the ages of 32 and 71, including ranging from sisters to seventh cousins, as they retrace the steps of the triangle trade, visiting the De Wolfe hometown of Bristol, Rhode Island, as well as slave forts on the coast of Ghana, and the ruins of a family plantation in Cuba. And then back home, the family confronts the thorny topic of what to do now that they have been exposed to this history. In the context of growing calls for reparations for slavery, family members struggle with the fundamental questions of how to think about and how to contribute to this repair, to help to repair the damage that their ancestors had done. Meanwhile, Brown and her family also come closer to the core, to their love-hate relationship with their own Yankee culture and the privilege from which they have benefited. The healing and the transformation they discover needed not only on the outside, but in fact on the inside. And perhaps most importantly, this is a documentary that raises fundamental questions. The issues that the De Wolfe descendants are confronted with dramatize questions that apply to the nation as a whole. For example, what exactly is the legacy of slavery for whites as well as for blacks and for others? Who owes what to whom for the sins of the fathers of this country? And what history do we inherit as individuals and citizens? How does Northern complicity change the equation and our understanding and our treatment of this history? What would it take to repair, to provide for the spiritual and material reparations for this horrendous chapter in American history? What would it take, and what would those reparations look like? These are all questions that arise from this documentary. So I want to commend this documentary to you, and I would like to encourage you to call 516-620-3602. That's the number to call, and make a pledge of support to get your copy of this documentary. You'll get it as a thank you gift when you make a pledge to WBAI at the $100 level. That's a $100 tax-deductible contribution to WBAI, and it's 516-620-3602. Remember, this is a documentary film. It is It is intended to be seen. We are going to share some clips, as we call them here in radio lingo. We're going to share some audio, some clips with you, which is to say, we're going to play some of the audio, but it is a documentary film. It is intended to be experienced visually as well, and the visual experience of the documentary film is something that I cannot describe. I can tell you that it is touching. I can tell you that it is moving, but that doesn't really tell you anything. I can tell you that it will revolutionize the way you think about this history. And I can tell you that it is not possible to watch this film, this documentary film, and not to be filled with a tremendous and not to be filled with so many questions. It's a really powerful piece of history, an important, a necessary, an important, and a revolutionary addition to the historical narrative, and a very significant achievement in our historiography. And so I would like to send this to you as a thank you gift when you make your pledge this afternoon. The number is 516-620-3602. That's 516-620-3602. Like you, I am somewhat disconcerted by the fact that we can't hear the phones ringing because this number is located off-site. So we're not going to hear the phones ringing in the studio. We'll be getting regular updates from the location. This is an off-site location. From the folks who are manning these telephones, we'll be getting updates, so I'll be able to tell you how we're doing. But right now, we do need to hear from you. We do need to urge you. I urge you to call 516-620-3602 and support this diadem in the middle of the FM dial. Our audio engineer, of course, is Mr. Michael G. Haskins, who is also our director of incidental music. Good afternoon, Mr. Michael G. Haskins. Great to see you at the beginning of first day of this winter membership and fundraising drive, and the first day of our Black History Month celebration.
Yes, Hugh, thank you very much, and I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy that we are doing this program, kicking off Black History Month today on Talkback. Well, we started with Esther Arma, wake-up call this morning, but we're excited about what we have for you, the presentations that we have, and as you said, Hugh, as historians begin to look more closely at these issues, at things becoming uncovered almost weekly and monthly, we are going to be sharing these things with you here on Talkback and on WBAI, and we can do this because you are supporting us. So again, let's give that number out as we get into the beginning of the program. It is 516-620-3602. 516-620-3602 for Talkback with Hugh Hamilton.
And thank you very much, Mr. Michael G. Haskins. It is now 30 minutes after the hour. This is WBAI, New York. Let's listen now to some of this documentary film. It's Traces of the Trade. A reminder, please continue to call while the presentation is in progress. The number is 516-620-3602. Here now, Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north.
Every year, my family would get together for July 4th in Bristol, Rhode Island. It was a big deal because Bristol boasts the longest-running 4th of July parade in the country. We'd watch the parade from the lawn of Linden Place. This big white mansion used to belong to my relatives. It's right in the center of town. This is me age 2 with my mother and grandmother. Here's me age 3, bossing my brother around. My DeWolf ancestors were known as the Great Folk in Bristol. There were professors and writers, artists and architects, and many Episcopal ministers. I was proud to be related to them. I was also drawn to this fairy tale world of old New England, these images of my grandparents when they were young. It never occurred to me to ask how we got so established. One day my grandmother traced back. I was in seminary when I got a booklet in the mail that she wrote for all her grandchildren. She shared our family history, all the happy days. She also explained that the first DeWolf, Mark Anthony, came to Bristol as a sailor in 1744. And then she wrote, "I haven't stomach enough to describe the ensuing slave trade." What hit me hard was the realization that I already knew this. Knew, but somehow buried it along the way. What no one in my family realized was that the DeWolfs were the largest slave-trading family in U.S. history. They brought over 10,000 Africans to the Americas in chains. 500,000 of their descendants could be alive today. This is me in my apartment in Boston. My name's Katrina Brown. I'm getting ready for a trip. A journey, really.
Okay, that's it in there.
I decided to retrace the slave trade route of my ancestors. From Rhode Island to Ghana to Cuba and back. I invited relatives to come with me, so we could reckon with this history together as a family. It felt like more than I could take on by myself.
My wife's is going down there. What the church?
It's the week of July 4th, 2001.
Wow.
Oh, yes.
Boy, and we figured if anybody was going to be late.
I tracked down 200 DeWolf descendants from all over the country and contacted them about coming on this trip. 9 people signed up. We range from siblings to 7th cousins. Many of us are actually meeting for the first time. DeWolfs have been going to St. Michael's Church for over 250 years. I wanted us to come here too. The church was pretty much new to me because I grew up in Philadelphia, where I was steeped in America's democratic ideals. In Bristol, it seems like the DeWolfs were the founding fathers. They were everywhere in the church. They even paid for the stained glass. My mind was swirling with all kinds of questions. What would we have to face on this trip? How would we have to rethink our sense of home and who we are today? But more importantly, what could we do as DeWolf descendants to help repair the enormous harm that our ancestors caused?
one of the rules that we felt in the family was what we call the no talk rule. And it's very big. You don't talk about unpleasant things. There's a line in one of our family books that one of our ancestors said that we should never talk about sex. What were the other things? Religion.
I think politics.
Right. And the last one was, and the Negroes. Yeah. That was the last one.
Out of the 200 people I wrote to about this project, 140 didn't respond at all. Of those who did respond, a few expressed concerns, but very politely. Only one person shared directly how totally upset he was. Basically, he's not trying to deny what happened. He's just worried that his black colleagues will change how they treat him, and black activists will suggest he has to pay. He doesn't think that's fair because he didn't do anything. Linden Place was also concerned about our journey. The mansion was built in 1810 by George DeWolf, one of the two most prominent slave traders in the family. Linden Place stayed in family hands until 1989, when it was turned into a museum. Some museum board members were worried about advertising this connection of Linden Place to slavery. They didn't let us film inside, so we just passed by.
And inside the fan lights, there's little angels. Yes, they're kind of like nymphs.
It was later when the house had already become a museum. I read a pamphlet about the history of the house, and there was like 2 or 3 sentences about the DeWolf brothers being slave traders, and it was very much in this sort of jovial style, like the good old boys did a little bit of this thing.
It was the same for me when I was growing up. I heard of the DeWolfs as pirates, adventuring on the high seas. My great-grandfather painted this mural with a whole sweep of Bristol's history, as if it was all a children's story. So when my grandmother told me about our family being in the slave trade, at first I was totally shocked. But in the next instant, I realized I already knew about this past. It was right there, hidden in plain view.
Talking about history, I feel the heaviness of pulling generations between slave trade, business, and now. And it just feels like a heavy load of repression. What kind of crazy partnership do we have to silence?
There's some guilt. Some members of the family certainly feel guilt and feel very weighted down by it. I'm very fortunate in that I don't.
My grandfather died when my dad was 2. We don't know anything about any of this, and you know, we're descended from a different leg of this family, and so it's you know, there's no amnesia, there's no guilt, there's nothing. It didn't exist.
I think I've gone through a whole cycle a couple of times through, and one part of the cycle is to say, this is really not my family when you think about it. I'm just a little piece of this. I have one drop of this family, but I'm just really not a DeWolf at all.
The Perrys went to visit an old family cemetery. They found the gravestone of an enslaved African.
Mrs. Adjouay. DeWolf?
Yes.
Oh, is that him or her? And no birth date. 74.
James DeWolf purchased 2 children on the African coast, Adjouay and Polydor, and gave them to his wife as Christmas presents. There's even a nursery rhyme that's been passed on.
Adjouay and Polydor sitting in the cellar door. Polydor and Adjouay sitting in the cellar way. Down fell the cellar door. Bump went Polydor. Up flew the cellar way. Off flew Adjouay.
It wasn't until I got into all this that I found out that not only did the North dominate the U.S. slave trade, but slavery itself was legal here for over 200 years. There weren't many large-scale plantations. Instead, folks in the North would own 1 or 2, maybe 3 slaves. The enslaved Africans would do work like building stone walls. They say there were enough stone walls in early New England to reach farther than the moon. There's an old document in Newport, a petition from a local merchant. He was asking city council to kindly remove the slave whipping post from outside his storefront because blood was getting on his windows.
If I try to get into my ancestors' boots, I find it very difficult. The stomach for violence must have been extraordinary.
What they did was strikingly evil. But these people were probably not all that much different from all of us. If we were there at that time, some of us may well have been involved in the slave trade. And I think that's something we've got to come to grips with.
We're using our glasses here 150 years, 200 years after these people are dead. I don't want to defend anything that happened in this family or in New England or in America, but I don't want to vilify these people either, because I don't know. I wasn't walking in their shoes.
Down at the harbor is James DeWolf's warehouse. This is where rum went out and sugar and molasses came in. James is the one who really masterminded the family takeover of all aspects of the trade. By the end of his life, in 1837, he was supposedly the second richest man in the United States.
When my first son was born, I had a real question of, do I inflict this on one more generation? Will this be a burden for my son to be James DeWolf Perry VI? And I chose to do it. It's hard to break a chain like that once it's started.
Bonnie Warren, a local historian, took us around.
James is a very smart man. He is savvy enough to know how to make money, how to change, how to roll with the times. In our world today, we have a Bill Gates. I mean, James DeWolf is brilliant. He knew how to do political, he knew how to get political favors to help his business. He also knew when to change and how to redirect. And he was, in his own way, extremely generous. So it's a very...
What strikes me is that this was big business. They made a lot of money at this. In economics, it's called vertical integration, controlling all aspects of an industry. But the bottom line is they really figured this out, and they seem to have made tremendous profits.
I had not realized that 3 generations of the family were involved in it, so it went on for a long time, which is embarrassing. You would have thought they would have gotten it, that this really isn't something that this should have been done. And they called themselves Christians at the same time.
It was a high risk and a high return, because if you hit hit it well, you made a great deal of money.
That's what I'm trying to understand. So the slave trade, people expected a 25% return?
Very high.
And so you had not just one person, you had a town of people who were invested in this
buying
trade.
shares. Yes.
Who's not involved? I mean, was there anyone around that was not involved in some way, either but directly or indirectly through the purchases they made, through the investments they made?
I think in general the whole town was supporting what was going on here. And that's a very, very good question.
The more historians we talked to, the more sobering it got.
The slave trade, you got to remember, is not just a few people taking a boat and sending it out. Everyone in town lived off slavery. The boat makers, the iron workers who make the shackles, the coopers who made the barrels to hold the rum, the distillers who took the molasses and sugar and made it into rum. So literally the whole town was dependent on the slave trade.
All of the North was involved. All these cities and towns along the coast, Salem, Boston, Providence, New London, New Haven, New York, and the rural areas around them, either traded slaves or manufactured goods or raised farm products for the slave trade.
It was John Adams who said, "I don't know why we should blush to confess that molasses was an essential ingredient in our independence." Well, and he could have very well extended the quote to say molasses, sugar, and the slave labor that produced this commerce.
At the Bristol Historical Society, tucked away in a corner on the second floor, there was a file cabinet full of DeWolf papers. These eerie records revealed the details of the logical economic model that the DeWolfs developed from 1769 to 1820. Here's how they made it work. First, they got the financing together. They recruited fellow townspeople to buy shares in their voyages, and eventually started their own bank. They also started an insurance company to cover the risk. Rum was the prime currency of the slave trade, so James acquired a distillery from his father-in-law. The DeWolfs also purchased ships, mostly from builders in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. The ships took rum to the Guinea coast to trade for Africans. July 4th, 1795, bought 9 prime slaves, 1 woman and 8 men, and paid for them tobacco, rum, hats, bread, mackerel. Many of the enslaved Africans were brought to work on plantations that the DeWolfs established in Cuba. These plantations supplied sugar and molasses needed to make the rum back in Bristol. They also served as holding places for Africans while the DeWolfs waited for slave prices to go up at auction. Havana, September 11th, 1806. John
upsetting me, but it's there.
And are those manacles or fetters?
Manacles or what?
Like irons.
Oh.
Legs.
Good point.
So, I mean, diving in and sort of going, oh, that many slaves. Oh, with this kind of condition on a slave boat. Oh, with things like this around their hands and their arms. When you get down to the concrete level of recreating the reality in your mind, where you really have to, you really have to sort of get the heart impact, because then you can,
Nobody wanted to ever talk about this, and it made everybody very uncomfortable. What these people are used to doing is presenting this pretty picture of who the DeWolfs were and taking people through Linden Place and